Have you ever been in a situation where your past came crashing back just when you thought you were finally safe? Where do you live? And have you ever had to start over somewhere completely new? Because sometimes running isn't enough, and the thing you're running from has a way of finding you anyway. The wine glass shattered against the marble floor of Bellinate, the city's most exclusive Italian restaurant, and Isla Chun knew her carefully constructed new life was about to crumble with it. She stood frozen behind the bar, her hands trembling as she watched the crimson liquid spread across the pristine white stone like blood from a wound. The sound echoed through the dimly lit dining room, causing several patrons to glance up from their conversations, but all she could see was him. Marcus Delacroix sat at table 12, his familiar predatory smile cutting through her composure like a blade through silk. 3 months. She'd managed to stay hidden for 3 months, working double shifts, paying cash for everything, never using her real name on anything that mattered. But somehow he'd found her. 2 hours earlier, Isla had been setting up the dining room for the evening service, her movements precise and practiced as she folded napkins into perfect peaks and aligned silverware with military precision. The ritual calmed her nerves, giving her shaking hands something productive to do while her mind worked through the familiar cycle of hypervigilance that had become second nature since she'd escaped. She'd been working at Bellinate for 6 weeks now, ever since she'd fled the cramped studio apartment she'd shared with Marcus in Queens. The restaurant job was a step up from the coffee shop where she worked mornings, the kind of place where wealthy businessmen conducted deals over $1,000 bottles of wine, and celebrities slipped in through back entrances to avoid paparazzi. The tips were good enough that she might actually be able to afford her own place soon, maybe even somewhere with a security deposit and a lease she could sign with her real name instead of the fake identity she'd been using. The irony wasn't lost on her that she felt safest in a restaurant owned by people who probably had their own complicated relationships with the law. Bellinate had a reputation for discretion, for protecting the privacy of its high-profile clientele, and that protection seemed to extend to its employees as well. The manager, Antonio, had hired her without asking too many questions about her spotty employment history or why she needed to be paid in cash. Sometimes the shadows provided the best hiding places. She'd been polishing wine glasses when she first noticed him at the corner table, the man who came in 3 times a week and always sat alone. Dante Romano commanded attention without trying, the kind of presence that made conversations quieter and servers more attentive. He was probably in his mid-30s, tall with perfectly styled dark hair and olive skin that suggested Mediterranean heritage. His suits were clearly bespoke, the kind of tailored perfection that cost more than most people made in 6 months. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale green-gray like sea glass, sharp and intelligent, and constantly aware of his surroundings. Isla had served him twice, and both times he'd been polite but distant, ordering expensive wine and never touching the food he'd ordered. He tipped well, always in cash, and she'd noticed he positioned himself so he could see both entrances to the restaurant. A businessman, she'd assumed, though the kind of business remained unclear. Now, watching Marcus lean back in his chair with that familiar expression of smug satisfaction, Isla felt her carefully controlled breathing begin to fray. He was wearing the same cologne that used to make her stomach turn, something expensive and cloying that reminded her of the nights when he'd come home drunk and angry, looking for someone to blame for whatever had gone wrong in his day. How had he found her? She'd been so careful, had followed every piece of advice from the domestic violence counselor about disappearing completely. No social media, no contact with mutual friends, no paper trail that could lead him back to her. She'd even changed her appearance, cutting her long black hair into a sharp bob and trading her conservative work clothes for the all-black uniform required at Bellinate. Marcus caught her eye and raised his glass in a mocking toast, his lips moving in a silent message she could read perfectly. Found you. The wine glass had slipped from her numb fingers then, the crash bringing her back to the present moment where she stood exposed and vulnerable in front of a room full of strangers. Antonio appeared at her elbow, his weathered face creased with concern as he took in her white complexion and shaking hands. "You're okay, Cara," he murmured in accented English, already moving to sweep up the glass. "These things happen. Take a moment." But Isla couldn't take a moment because Marcus was standing now, straightening his jacket with deliberate slowness as he began to cross the dining room toward her. She'd seen that walk before, predatory and confident, the stride of a man who'd never been told no and had no intention of accepting it now. The other diners seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, conversations becoming more subdued as Marcus approached the bar. He moved like he owned the space, his gaze locked on Isla with the intensity of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "Hello, sweetheart," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar undertone of possession that made her skin crawl. "You didn't think you could hide from me forever, did you?" Antonio stepped forward, his protective instincts clearly activated, but Marcus dismissed him with a look that promised trouble if he interfered. At 6 foot with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym, Marcus had always used his physical presence to intimidate, and it was working now. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," Isla managed, her voice barely steady, "but you need to leave." Marcus smiled, the expression sharp and cold. "Oh, I don't think so. We have unfinished business, you and I. You left some things behind when you disappeared in the middle of the night like a thief." That was when Dante Romano stood up. Isla had forgotten he was even there, her tunnel vision focused entirely on the threat in front of her. But suddenly he was moving with fluid grace across the dining room. There was something different about his posture now, a coiled danger that hadn't been apparent when he was simply another wealthy customer enjoying an expensive meal. "Excuse me," Dante said, his voice carrying easily across the space despite its quiet tone. "I believe the lady asked you to leave." Marcus turned, clearly prepared to dismiss this interruption the same way he had Antonio, but something in Dante's expression made him pause. The restaurant had gone completely silent, even the kitchen sounds seeming muted as every person in the room held their breath. "This is a private conversation," Marcus said, puffing up slightly in the way men did when their territory was challenged. Dante stepped closer, and Isla could see the precise control in his movements, like a predator who knew exactly how dangerous he was and exactly how much force would be required to neutralize any threat. "Not anymore," he said simply. The two men faced each other for a long moment, and Isla watched Marcus's confidence begin to crack as he took in Dante's stillness. The way he held himself like violence was simply another tool in his arsenal. Whatever Marcus saw in Dante's pale eyes made him take a step backward. "You don't know who you're messing with," Marcus blustered, but his voice had lost its earlier command. Dante's smile was sharp as winter. "Actually, I do. Marcus Delacroix, unemployed and facing charges for domestic violence in Queens. Recently evicted from your apartment on Astoria Boulevard for failure to pay rent. Currently driving a 2018 Honda Civic with expired registration and a suspended license." The color drained from Marcus's face as he realized that this stranger knew details about his life that shouldn't have been available to casual inquiry. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone you don't want to make an enemy of," Dante replied. "Now, the lady asked you to leave. I'm going to give you exactly 30 seconds to walk out that door before I make you leave." Something in Dante's tone made it clear that being made to leave would be significantly more unpleasant than choosing to go voluntarily. Marcus looked between Dante and Isla, his jaw working as he struggled with the realization that for once, he wasn't the most dangerous person in the room. "This isn't over," he said finally, the threat directed at Isla, but lacking its earlier conviction. "Wait outside," Dante said, his voice dropping to something that was barely above a whisper, but somehow more threatening than any shout. "I'll take care of this." Marcus left, pushing through the restaurant's front entrance with enough force to rattle the glass. The moment he was gone, Isla's knees buckled, adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. She would have fallen if Dante hadn't caught her, his hands warm and steady on her arms as he guided her to the bar. "Breathe," he said quietly, his earlier menace completely gone as he focused on her obvious distress. "You're safe now." But Isla knew she wasn't safe, would never be safe as long as Marcus was alive and free to hunt her down. She looked up into Dante's concerned face, seeing kindness there alongside the controlled power that had sent her stalker running, and felt something crack open in her chest. "He'll come back," she whispered, the words barely audible. "He always comes back." Dante's expression hardened, and she caught a glimpse of the man who had made Marcus retreat with nothing more than a few quiet words. "Not if I have anything to say about it." In that moment, looking into eyes that promised protection she'd never dared hope for. Isla realized that her life was about to change again. The question was whether this time it would be for the better. Antonio disappeared into the kitchen, muttering rapid Italian under his breath that sounded like a mixture of prayers and curses. Isla remained perched on the bar stool where Dante had guided her, her hands wrapped around a glass of water she couldn't seem to remember picking up. The ice clinked against the sides as her trembling refused to subside, each small sound making her flinch as if Marcus might materialize from the noise itself. Dante moved with purpose toward the front windows, his gaze scanning the street beyond the restaurant's elegant facade. Even from across the room, Isla could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a soldier on patrol. When he returned to her side, his expression was grim. "He's sitting in his car across the street," Dante said quietly, settling onto the stool beside her with fluid grace. Watching the entrance, Isla's stomach dropped, the small hope that Marcus might actually leave evaporating like steam. Of course he was waiting. Marcus had never been the type to accept defeat, especially not public humiliation in front of an audience. She'd seen that stubborn rage before, the way it could simmer for hours or days before exploding into something far worse than the original confrontation. "He'll wait all night if he has to," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft jazz playing through the restaurant sound system. "That's what he does. He waits until you think it's safe, and then—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the memories of the times Marcus had cornered her when she'd let her guard down. The parking garage at her old job, the laundromat at midnight when she'd thought she was alone, the grocery store checkout line where he'd appeared behind her like a ghost, his hand finding her wrist with bruising pressure as he'd whispered threats disguised as sweet nothings. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "How long has this been going on?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications that made Isla's chest constrict. She'd never told anyone the full truth about Marcus, not the domestic violence counselor who'd helped her escape, not the co-workers who'd noticed her bruises, not even the police officers who'd taken her statement after the last incident. Admitting the scope of his stalking behavior felt like acknowledging her own stupidity for staying as long as she had. 2 years, she said finally, the words falling from her lips like stones. "The stalking, I mean. We were together for 4 years before that, and he was controlling, jealous. But after I tried to leave the first time, it got worse." Dante nodded slowly, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "The first time?" Isla's laugh was bitter and hollow. "I tried to leave 3 times. The first time, he convinced me he'd change, that he'd get therapy and work on his anger. The second time, he threatened to kill himself if I didn't come back. Said his death would be on my hands. And the third time?" Dante's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the controlled anger underneath. "The third time, I didn't tell him I was leaving." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I waited until he went to work, packed 1 bag, and disappeared. I thought I was smart about it, you know? I'd been planning for months, saving cash, researching how to start over. I changed my name, my appearance, moved to a different borough. I thought 3 months was enough time for him to move on." Dante's expression darkened. "Men like Marcus don't move on. They escalate." The simple statement hit Isla like a physical blow because she knew he was right. She'd been telling herself that Marcus would eventually get bored, find someone new to torment. But deep down, she'd always known better. He viewed her as property, and in his mind, she'd stolen herself from him. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, the confession scraping her throat raw. "No family, no close friends who don't know him. I've been working 3 jobs just to afford a studio apartment in Queens, and if Antonio fires me because of tonight..." She couldn't finish the thought. The math was simple and terrifying. Without her restaurant wages, she couldn't make rent. Without rent money, she'd be homeless within a month. And homeless meant vulnerable in ways that made Marcus's stalking seem almost manageable by comparison. Antonio emerged from the kitchen then, his weathered face creased with worry as he approached their corner of the bar. His movements were agitated, hands gesturing as he spoke in rapid, accented English. "Isla, Cara, I am so sorry, but I think maybe you should go home early tonight. This man, this situation, it makes the other customers uncomfortable." Perhaps tomorrow we can discuss. His voice trailed off as he noticed Dante's expression, the way the other man's stillness had shifted into something predatory. The restaurant owner took a step backward, suddenly remembering that while Dante was a valued customer, he was also someone whose business dealings remained deliberately vague. Actually, Antonio, Dante said, his tone polite but carrying an undertone that made it clear this wasn't a request. I think it would be better if you ensured Isla's safety tonight. This man who's threatening her, he's dangerous. The kind of dangerous that doesn't respect boundaries or care about collateral damage. Antonio's eyes widened as he processed the implications. You think he would hurt other people? The other staff? Dante's shrug was elegant and terrifying. Men like that don't think rationally. They think in terms of ownership and revenge. Right now, he's focused on Isla, but if he feels cornered or humiliated, well, let's just say it would be unfortunate if any of your other employees got caught in the crossfire. The color drained from Antonio's face as he realized that by suggesting Isla leave, he might actually be putting his other staff at risk. In Marcus's twisted logic, anyone who helped her or stood between them would become a legitimate target. What do you suggest? Antonio asked, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Dante turned to Isla, his gaze gentle despite the steel beneath. I have a place where you'd be safe. Security, privacy, space to figure out your next move without looking over your shoulder every 5 minutes. Isla felt her world tilt sideways. A week ago, Dante Romano had been nothing more than a mysterious regular customer who tipped well and minded his own business. Now he was offering to protect her from a stalker who'd already proven he could find her anywhere she tried to hide. The logical part of her mind screamed warnings about jumping from one dangerous situation into another, but the exhausted, terrified part whispered that she was out of options. I don't even know you, she said quietly, though the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. Dante's smile was small and sad. No, you don't. But you know Marcus, and you know what he's capable of. What I'm offering is a chance to sleep through the night without checking your locks every hour. A chance to walk outside without scanning every face on the street. The simple description of basic safety hit Isla harder than any grand gesture could have. When had her life become so small, so controlled by fear, that the idea of sleeping peacefully felt like an impossible luxury? Why? She asked, the question encompassing everything she couldn't articulate. Why help her? Why get involved? Why risk whatever comfortable life he'd built for a waitress with dangerous baggage? Dante was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as if he was seeing something beyond the elegant dining room. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience with violence and its aftermath. Because men who hurt women are a particular kind of coward, he said simply, and because everyone deserves to feel safe in their own life. Isla looked around the restaurant, taking in the concerned faces of her co-workers, Antonio's obvious anxiety, the way even the customers seemed aware that something significant was happening. Through the front windows, she could see Marcus's car still parked across the street, a malignant presence that poisoned even this small sanctuary she tried to build. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Stay here and wait for Marcus to escalate, or trust a stranger who'd already shown more concern for her safety than anyone had in months. Okay, she said, the word barely audible, but carrying the weight of complete surrender. I'll go with you. Dante nodded, his expression becoming businesslike as he shifted into protection mode. We'll leave through the kitchen entrance. Antonio, can you have someone watch the front? Make sure he doesn't follow us immediately? Antonio nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have a plan that didn't involve confronting Marcus directly. Of course, whatever you need. As Isla gathered her purse and jacket with numb fingers, she caught sight of herself in the mirror behind the bar. She looked fragile and pale, like a woman who'd forgotten what it felt like to exhale completely. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't been present an hour ago. For the first time in months, she looked like a woman who might have a future beyond simply surviving until tomorrow. Dante appeared at her elbow, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of safety rather than threat. Ready? He asked quietly. Isla took one last look at the restaurant that had been her sanctuary until tonight, knowing that whatever came next, she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Then she met Dante's steady gaze and nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt endless, each illuminated number making Isla's stomach tighten with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. She'd never been higher than the 6th floor of any building, and the smooth, silent ascent felt like leaving the world she knew behind entirely. Dante stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but he maintained a careful distance that somehow managed to be both reassuring and respectful. When the doors opened directly into his penthouse, Isla's breath caught in her throat. The space was massive, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture that probably cost more than she'd made in her entire life. The city stretched out beyond the glass like a carpet of lights, Manhattan twinkling below them as if they were floating above the world itself. "This is home," Dante said simply, though his eyes were focused on her reaction rather than the spectacular view. "The guest suite is through here." Isla followed him across polished hardwood floors that gleamed under recessed lighting, trying not to gawk at the artwork on the walls or the kitchen that looked like something from a luxury magazine. Everything was elegant and expensive, but there was a warmth to the space that surprised her. Books stacked on side tables, a coffee mug left on the granite counter, small signs that someone actually lived here rather than simply using it as a showpiece. A man emerged from what appeared to be a home office, tall and lean with salt and pepper hair and the kind of alert posture that suggested military training. When he saw Dante wasn't alone, his hand moved instinctively toward his jacket in a gesture that made Isla's pulse quicken. "Marco," Dante said easily, "this is Isla. She'll be staying with us for a while. I want a full security detail starting tonight." Marco's gaze shifted between them, clearly processing the implications. "The man from the restaurant? Handled for now, but he'll escalate. Make sure the building security knows to watch for him. And I want someone on the street level at all times." The casual efficiency of the exchange made Isla realize she'd stepped into a world where personal protection was routine, where having armed men available at a moment's notice was simply another household expense. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, she was somewhere Marcus couldn't simply appear and corner her. Marco nodded curtly and disappeared back into the office, already reaching for his phone. Dante continued down the hallway, stopping at a door near the end. "This will be your room," he said, pushing it open to reveal a space larger than her entire queen's apartment. The guest suite had its own bathroom, a walk-in closet, and another wall of windows that offered a different angle on the city lights. The bed was enormous, piled with pillows and covered in what looked like genuine silk. Isla stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the luxury and the implications of occupying such a space. "I can't afford this," she said quietly, voicing the fear that had been building since they'd left the restaurant. "Whatever this costs, I can't pay you back." Dante's expression gentled. "This isn't about money, Isla. This is about keeping you safe while we figure out a permanent solution to your problem." The way he said permanent solution made something cold settle in her stomach. In her experience, men who spoke about solving problems usually meant violence, and while she wanted Marcus gone from her life, the thought of blood on her hands made her feel sick. "What kind of solution?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dante was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Marcus is escalating because he feels like he has nothing to lose. Men like him respond to incentives, to consequences that matter more than their obsession. Sometimes that means legal consequences, sometimes it means social ones. And sometimes it means helping them understand that their behavior has costs they're not prepared to pay." The careful phrasing didn't disguise the threat underneath, but Isla found herself less disturbed by it than she should have been. After months of looking over her shoulder, of jumping at every sound and checking locks multiple times each night, the idea of someone else taking responsibility for her safety felt like a luxury she'd forgotten existed. "There are clothes in the closet that should fit you," Dante continued, steering the conversation back to practical matters. "Basics that my housekeeper keeps on hand for unexpected guests. Tomorrow we can arrange for anything else you need." Isla opened the closet door and found it stocked with women's clothing in her approximate size. Everything from casual wear to business attire to sleepwear that looked expensive enough to be investment pieces. The efficiency of it made her wonder how often Dante provided sanctuary for women in trouble, then decided she probably didn't want to know. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said, turning back to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't owe me anything. We barely know each other." Dante leaned against the doorframe, his posture casual but his eyes serious. "When I was 12, my mother spent 6 weeks in the hospital because my father couldn't control his temper. She never pressed charges, never left him, but I swore then that if I ever had the power to help a woman in a similar situation, I would." The simple honesty of the admission hit Isla like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her own fear, her own survival, that she hadn't considered Dante might have his own reasons for recognizing the signs of abuse and responding to them. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, meaning it in ways that went beyond politeness. Dante's smile was small and sad. "Me too. But that's why I understand what Marcus is, what he's capable of, and why I won't let him hurt you again." The conviction in his voice made something tight in Isla's chest loosen for the first time in months. She'd been carrying the weight of her fear alone for so long that having someone else acknowledge its validity felt almost overwhelming. "Are you hungry?" Dante asked, clearly sensing her emotional overwhelm and offering a practical distraction. "I was about to make dinner." Isla realized she hadn't eaten since her coffee shop shift that morning, too nervous about the evening shift to manage more than a few bites of toast. Her stomach responded to the mention of food with an audible growl that made her blush. Dante laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I'll take that as a yes. Why don't you get settled? Maybe take a shower if you want. Dinner will be ready in about an hour." Alone in the guest room, Isla sank onto the bed and tried to process the surreal turn her life had taken. 12 hours ago, her biggest worry had been whether she'd earn enough in tips to make her rent payment. Now she was sitting in a penthouse that probably cost more per month than she'd ever seen at one time, under the protection of a man who clearly had his own complicated relationship with violence. Her phone buzzed in her purse, and her blood turned to ice when she saw Marcus's name on the screen. The text message was brief and predictable. "You can't hide forever. He's not always going to be around to protect you." Before she could fully process the implications of Marcus somehow getting Dante's information, her phone rang. She stared at it for several seconds before forcing herself to answer. "Hello, Marcus," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out who your new boyfriend is?" Marcus's voice was thick with rage and something that might have been alcohol. "Dante Romano. Interesting choice, sweetheart. Do you know what kind of man you're sleeping with?" Isla's hand tightened on the phone. "We're not sleeping together. Yet." Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "But you will be. That's what men like him do, Isla. They collect damaged women and use them until they get bored. At least with me, you knew where you stood." The twisted logic made her stomach turn, but before she could respond, the phone was gently taken from her hand. She hadn't heard Dante enter the room, but he was there, close enough that she could smell his cologne again, close enough that his presence pushed back the immediate panic Marcus's voice had triggered. "Marcus," Dante said into the phone, his voice conversational and deadly calm. "I was hoping you'd call." There was silence on the other end, then Marcus's voice, less confident now. "Who the hell do you think you are?" "I'm the man who's going to give you exactly one chance to walk away from this," Dante replied. "You're going to delete Isla's number from your phone, you're going to forget you ever knew her name, and you're going to find someone else to occupy your time." "Or what?" Dante's smile was visible in his voice. "Or you're going to discover that some people have resources that go far beyond calling your ex-girlfriend and making threats." The line went dead. Dante looked at the phone for a moment, then powered it off completely before handing it back to Isla. "He won't be calling again tonight," he said simply. "How can you be sure?" "Because now he knows he's dealing with someone who has the means to make his life very complicated very quickly. Men like Marcus are fundamentally cowards, Isla. They target women they think are helpless because they're too weak to face real opposition." Dante moved toward the door, then paused. "Dinner will be ready soon. Try to rest until then." Alone again, Isla found herself believing for the first time in months that she might actually be safe. The feeling was so unfamiliar, so long absent from her life, that it took her several minutes to recognize it for what it was. When she finally made her way to the kitchen an hour later, she found Dante standing at the stove in jeans and a casual sweater, looking nothing like the dangerous man who'd made Marcus retreat with a few quiet words. He'd cooked pasta in a sauce that smelled like heaven, and the domestic normalcy of the scene made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. Watching his hands as he moved efficiently around the kitchen, she noticed the small scars on his knuckles, evidence of a life that had required him to fight for what mattered. But those same hands were gentle as he served her dinner, careful and patient in ways that made her remember what it felt like to be cared for rather than controlled. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Isla felt safe enough to imagine that tomorrow might actually come. 3 days in Dante's penthouse had given Isla a glimpse of what normal life might feel like, and the contrast with her previous existence was almost overwhelming. She woke each morning without the familiar spike of adrenaline that came from scanning her surroundings for threats, spent her days reading in the library, or helping Dante prepare meals that didn't come from vending machines or convenience stores. For the first time in months, she'd slept through the night without jerking awake at every small sound. The routine they'd fallen into felt surprisingly domestic for two people who barely knew each other. Dante worked from his home office most mornings, handling business calls in rapid Italian that she pretended not to find attractive. She discovered he was fluent in at least 4 languages and had a collection of first edition books that suggested interests beyond whatever dangerous occupation had funded his lifestyle. In the evenings, they cooked together, their conversations ranging from safe topics like literature and travel to more personal revelations that built trust incrementally. But the illusion of safety shattered when Marco appeared in the kitchen that Wednesday morning, his expression grim as he handed Dante a tablet displaying security footage from the coffee shop where Isla worked her morning shifts. The video showed Marcus cornering Jenny, the 19-year-old college student who worked the opening shift, backing her against the espresso machine as he demanded information about Isla's schedule and whereabouts. Even without sound, the footage clearly showed Jenny's terror as Marcus leaned closer, his posture aggressive and intimidating. Isla's stomach dropped as she watched the scene unfold. Jenny was barely out of high school, working her way through community college with the kind of determination Isla recognized in herself. She didn't deserve to be dragged into this nightmare because of Isla's presence in her life. "When did this happen?" Dante asked, his voice deadly calm as he studied the screen. 20 minutes ago, Marco replied. Our people were watching the restaurant, but we weren't monitoring her other workplace. He threatened the girl for about 10 minutes before she finally gave him some information about Isla's schedule. What kind of information? Isla asked, though she dreaded the answer. Marco's expression was apologetic but direct. That you haven't been to work in 3 days. That you usually work Tuesday and Thursday mornings. That you've seemed scared lately and mentioned having trouble with an ex-boyfriend. The implications hit Isla like physical blows. Marcus now knew she was staying somewhere else, knew her pattern of absence would continue, and worse, knew that other people in her life were aware of his harassment. In his twisted logic, that made them witnesses, potential allies to eliminate. He'll go after her again, Isla whispered, sinking onto one of the kitchen bar stools as the weight of responsibility crushed down on her. And Tom, the manager, and anyone else who works there. This is my fault. Dante's expression darkened as he watched her spiral into self-blame. No, this is Marcus's fault for being a predator who can't accept that you don't belong to him. But I brought this into their lives, Isla insisted, her voice rising with panic and guilt. They're innocent people who don't deserve to be threatened because I was too weak to handle my own problems. The words hung in the air for a moment before Dante moved, crossing the space between them with swift purpose. His hands settled on either side of her face, forcing her to meet his gaze as he spoke with quiet intensity. Listen to me carefully, he said, his voice gentle but implacable. You are not weak for being targeted by an abuser. You are not weak for needing help to escape a dangerous situation. And you are sure as hell not responsible for his choice to threaten innocent people. Isla felt tears she'd been holding back for days spill over, the combination of guilt and fear and unexpected kindness overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. I can't stay here, she said through the tears. I'm putting you in danger too, and your people, and I can't live with that. She tried to pull away, to put distance between them before her presence brought violence to his doorstep, but Dante's hands remained steady on her face, anchoring her in place. You're not going anywhere, he said simply, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a request or suggestion. You don't understand, Isla protested, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. Marcus doesn't just give up. He escalates until someone gets hurt, and I won't let that someone be you. Dante's smile was sharp and cold, the expression of a man who'd faced threats before and emerged victorious. Isla, Kara, I think you're underestimating what I'm capable of handling. The endearment sent warmth through her chest, even as she struggled with the implications of staying. But what if he hurts Jenny? What if he goes after other people I work with? Then we make sure he understands that threatening people under my protection has consequences he can't afford, Dante replied, his thumb stroking gently across her cheekbones. This stopped being just about you the moment he walked into that restaurant and made you afraid. The possessive undertone in his voice made something deep in Isla's chest flutter with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. She'd never had anyone claim responsibility for her safety before, never experienced the profound relief of knowing someone else would shoulder the burden of protecting her. But what does that mean? She asked quietly, though part of her suspected the answer would involve the kind of violence that had sent Marcus running from the restaurant. Dante was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face as if measuring how much truth she could handle. It means Marcus is going to learn that some people are more dangerous than he is, and that continuing this behavior will cost him everything he values. Before Isla could fully process the implications of that statement, Dante's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened into something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. Marcus, he answered, his voice conversational despite the steel underneath. Isla could hear Marcus's voice through the phone, loud enough to catch fragments of what sounded like threats and demands. She watched Dante's face as he listened, noting the way his jaw tightened incrementally with each word. I see, Dante said finally, when Marcus had apparently finished his rant. And you think threatening my business associates is going to accomplish what, exactly? There was more shouting from the phone, Marcus's voice rising to a pitch that suggested alcohol or drugs might be involved. Dante listened with the patience of a man accustomed to dealing with irrationality, but Isla could see the controlled anger building behind his eyes. Let me be very clear about something, Marcus, Dante said, cutting through the other man's tirade. Isla is under my protection now. That means threats against her are threats against me, and threats against me tend to have very permanent consequences. The shouting from the phone stopped abruptly, replaced by silence that stretched long enough to suggest Marcus was finally grasping the magnitude of his miscalculation. You have 24 hours to disappear from her life completely, Dante continued. After that, the conversation becomes significantly less civilized. He ended the call and looked at Isla, whose face had gone pale as she processed what she'd just heard. He threatened your business? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dante nodded grimly. Apparently, he's done some research, figured out that I own several legitimate companies as well as the restaurant. He called my office this morning and told my assistant that he had information about illegal activities he'd be happy to share with law enforcement unless I stopped harboring his property. The casual reference to her as property made Isla's stomach turn, but it was the threat to Dante's livelihood that made her truly understand how far Marcus had escalated. He wasn't just stalking her anymore. He was actively trying to destroy anyone who helped her. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words inadequate for the scope of danger her presence had brought into Dante's life. Dante moved closer, his hands settling on her shoulders as he studied her face. You have nothing to apologize for. If anything, I should thank him. Thank him? Dante's smile was dangerous and predatory. He just made this personal in a way that gives me complete justification for handling it permanently. The words should have terrified her, but instead Isla felt a fierce surge of relief that someone was finally willing to match Marcus's escalation with consequences that might actually stop him. She'd spent months being afraid, months letting his threats control every aspect of her life. And the idea of that ending felt almost too good to believe. What happens now? She asked. Now, Dante said, his hands sliding from her shoulders to frame her face again, we make sure you're safe. Everything else is my responsibility. Looking up at him, Isla realized that somewhere in the space of 3 days, her feelings had shifted from gratitude to something deeper and more complicated. The way he touched her, gentle but possessive, made her pulse quicken with more than just relief. The controlled anger in his voice when Marcus threatened her spoke to something primal in her chest that had been dormant for years. Without thinking, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. The contact was soft and brief, barely more than a brush of lips, but the effect was immediate and electric. Dante went completely still for a heartbeat. Then his arms came around her, pulling her closer as he deepened the kiss with a hunger that made her knees weak. She could taste the coffee he'd been drinking, could feel the controlled strength in the hands that cradled her head, could sense the careful restraint that kept him from overwhelming her even as his own need became apparent. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than the situation strictly warranted, Dante rested his forehead against hers. "Isla," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion she couldn't quite identify. "I know this is complicated," she whispered, her hands fisted in the front of his shirt. "I know the timing is terrible, and I'm probably making everything more difficult, but I can't pretend I don't feel something when you look at me like that." Dante's laugh was low and a little pained. "Kara, you're not making anything difficult. You're making it very, very easy to forget why I should be keeping my distance." The admission made warmth spread through her chest, the first genuine happiness she'd felt in longer than she could remember. "Why should you keep your distance?" "Because you've just escaped one dangerous man, and the last thing you need is to get involved with another one." The honesty hit her harder than any sweet nothing could have, but instead of pushing her away, it made her trust him more. "You're not like Marcus," she said with quiet conviction. "No," Dante agreed, his thumb stroking across her cheekbones. "But I am dangerous, Isla. The things I'm going to do to keep you safe, the world I live in, it's not something you should take lightly." She studied his face, seeing the genuine concern there alongside the desire, and made her choice. "Then it's a good thing I'm not taking any of this lightly," she said, rising up to kiss him again. This time, when his arms tightened around her, she didn't feel trapped or controlled. She felt claimed in the best possible way, protected by someone who understood exactly what kind of monster he was dealing with and had the power to eliminate it completely. Outside the penthouse windows, the city continued its relentless pace, but inside their bubble of safety and growing connection, Isla finally allowed herself to believe that Marcus's reign of terror might actually be coming to an end. The call came at 7 in the morning, jolting both Isla and Dante from the first peaceful sleep they'd shared in his bed. Marco's voice was tight with controlled urgency as he delivered news that made Isla's blood turn to ice. "He tried to take her," Marco reported, his words clipped and professional despite the gravity of the situation. "Jenny, the girl from the coffee shop." Marcus grabbed her in the parking lot when she arrived for her opening shift. "Our people intervened before he could get her in his car." Isla sat up in bed, the sheet clutched to her chest as the implications crashed over her. Marcus hadn't just escalated to threatening people in her life. He'd actually tried to kidnap an innocent girl, probably planning to use Jenny as leverage to force Isla out of hiding. "Is she hurt?" Isla asked, her voice barely steady as guilt and horror warred in her chest. "Shaken up, but physically unharmed," Marco replied. "She's with our medic now, and we've contacted her family. But this changes everything. He's moved beyond intimidation into actual violent crime." Dante was already moving, pulling on clothes with swift efficiency as he processed the tactical implications. "Where is Marcus now?" "Gone. Fled the scene when our people showed up, but we're tracking his vehicle. He can't run far. Not anymore." Isla felt sick as she imagined Jenny's terror, the girl's confusion at being grabbed by a stranger because of her tangential connection to Isla's life. The weight of responsibility was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that Marcus's desperation was escalating beyond anything she'd anticipated. "This is my fault," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "Jenny could have been killed because of me." Dante turned to face her, his expression implacable as he crossed back to the bed. "No, Kara. This is Marcus's fault for being a predator who thinks he can take whatever he wants through violence. But if I hadn't worked there, if I hadn't brought this into their lives, if you hadn't existed, Marcus would have found another woman to terrorize," Dante said, his hands framing her face with gentle firmness. "This is who he is, Isla. You didn't create his nature, and you're not responsible for his choices." The logical part of her mind knew he was right, but the emotional weight of Jenny's trauma felt like a physical burden on her chest. She'd spent her whole life trying not to be a burden to anyone, trying to handle her problems without involving innocent people, and now her mere existence had put a 19-year-old girl in mortal danger. "I want to be there," Isla said suddenly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "When you confront him, I want to be there." Dante's expression darkened with immediate concern. "Absolutely not. This man just tried to commit kidnapping, Isla. He's completely unhinged and desperate, which makes him exponentially more dangerous." "I know," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "But I've been running from him for months, letting my fear control every aspect of my life. I need to face him, to look him in the eye when his power over me ends forever." Dante studied her face, clearly torn between his protective instincts and his recognition of what this moment represented for her healing. The conversation was interrupted by Marco's return. "We found him," Marco announced. "He's holed up in a warehouse in Queens, probably planning his next move. We can have him contained within the hour." Dante nodded grimly, his mind clearly shifting into tactical mode. "Full team. I want every exit covered and complete control of the environment before we move." "What about the police?" Isla asked, though even as she said it, she knew the answer wouldn't satisfy her need for justice. "Marcus crossed lines today that the police can't adequately address," Dante replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience with inadequate legal remedies. "Besides, men like him don't stay in prison long enough to matter. They get out, and they come back angrier." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Dante wasn't planning to hand Marcus over to law enforcement. He was planning to eliminate the threat permanently. The thought should have horrified her, but instead Isla felt a fierce surge of relief that someone was finally willing to match Marcus's violence with consequences that would actually stop him. "I'm going with you," she said again, her voice leaving no room for argument. Dante's jaw tightened as he weighed the risks against her obvious need to reclaim her agency. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You stay in the car with armed protection until the situation is completely controlled. You don't enter that building until I personally guarantee it's safe." The warehouse was exactly what Isla had expected, grimy and abandoned, the kind of place where bad things happened without witnesses. Dante's team moved with military precision, surrounding the building and cutting off all escape routes before the main confrontation began. From her position in the reinforced car, Isla watched through tinted windows as Dante and 3 of his men disappeared into the building. The wait felt endless, every minute stretching like hours as she imagined what was happening inside. When gunshots echoed from the warehouse, brief and decisive, Isla's heart stopped completely. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the violence, leaving her to wonder who had survived and who hadn't. Dante emerged 20 minutes later, his expression grim but satisfied as he approached the car. "It's over," he said simply, opening her door and extending his hand to help her out. "Is he?" she began, then stopped, not sure how to finish the question. "He made his choice," Dante replied, his tone making it clear that Marcus had chosen violence and faced the inevitable consequences. Isla felt an overwhelming rush of emotions. Relief that the threat was finally gone, grief for the life that violence had cost, and a strange sense of closure that she'd never expected to achieve. For the first time in years, she could imagine a future that didn't involve looking over her shoulder or planning escape routes from every room she entered. "What happens now?" she asked as they stood in the shadow of the building where her nightmare had finally ended. "Now we go home," Dante said, his arms coming around her with gentle strength. "Now you get to live your life without fear." The word home hit her with unexpected force, because somewhere in the chaos of the past week, Dante's penthouse had become exactly that. Not just a safe house or temporary shelter, but the place where she felt most herself, most protected, most capable of imagining happiness. "I love you," she said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them or worry about timing or appropriateness. Dante's smile was soft and fierce and completely transformative. "I love you too, Kara. More than I thought possible." When he kissed her in the shadow of the warehouse, Isla tasted freedom and safety and the promise of a future built on protection rather than fear. She'd entered his world as a victim seeking shelter, but she was choosing to stay as a woman claiming her right to be loved and defended. The drive back to Manhattan felt like traveling from her old life into her new one. Each mile taking her further from the terror Marcus had represented and closer to the happiness she'd almost forgotten was possible. Beside her, Dante's hand covered hers, warm and steady and completely committed to whatever came next. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Isla wasn't afraid of tomorrow. 6 weeks after Marcus's death, Isla woke up in Dante's bed without the familiar spike of anxiety that had defined her mornings for so long. The September sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, warming the silk sheets and casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors. Beside her, Dante was already awake, propped up on one elbow as he watched her with the soft expression that never failed to make her heart skip. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple as she stretched languidly against him. The simple greeting carried weight that went beyond politeness. Every morning for the past month and a half, Dante had made a point of reminding her that she was safe, cherished, completely free from the fear that had controlled her life for so long. The consistency of his care had gradually convinced her nervous system to relax, to trust that this happiness was real and permanent. "Today feels different," she said, unable to pinpoint exactly why, but sensing some shift in the atmosphere. Dante's smile was mysterious as he slipped out of bed, already dressed in the casual slacks and button-down shirt that had become his weekend uniform. "Maybe because it is different. Get dressed, Kara. We're going somewhere special." An hour later, they were driving along the Hudson River, the autumn foliage painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that made the world look like something from a fairy tale. Isla had traded her old habit of scanning every car for threats for the simple pleasure of watching the scenery pass, her hand entwined with Dante's as he navigated the winding roads with practiced ease. "Where are we going?" she asked for the third time, laughing when he simply squeezed her fingers and continued driving with that secretive smile. "Somewhere I've been meaning to show you," he replied, the same answer he'd given the previous 2 times. They stopped at a vineyard in the Hudson Valley, the kind of place Isla had only seen in magazines before her life had intersected with Dante's world of casual luxury. The main building was elegant stone and glass, surrounded by rolling hills covered in carefully tended grapevines that stretched toward distant mountains. "This is incredible," Isla breathed as they walked hand in hand through the vineyard grounds. The peace of the setting was almost overwhelming after months of hypervigilance and fear. "My family has owned this place for 3 generations," Dante said, his pride evident as he gestured toward the neat rows of vines. "My grandfather planted the first grapes when he immigrated from Sicily, back when this was considered too far from the city to be profitable." They walked through the vineyard in comfortable silence, Isla absorbing the profound sense of legacy and belonging that emanated from every carefully maintained vine. This was Dante's heritage, the legitimate foundation beneath the more complicated aspects of his business empire. The tour ended at a small terrace overlooking the valley, where a table had been set for 2 with china and crystal that caught the afternoon sunlight. The lunch that followed was perfect. Local wine that tasted like sunshine and earth, fresh bread with olive oil that Dante's family produced on their property in Sicily, and conversation that flowed as naturally as the wine. As they lingered over espresso and delicate pastries, Dante reached across the table to take her hand, his expression shifting to something more serious and purposeful. "Isla, these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life," he said, his thumb stroking across her knuckles with gentle reverence. "Before I met you, I thought I understood what I wanted, what would make me complete. But you've shown me that everything I thought I knew about love was just a shadow of the real thing." Her breath caught as he stood and moved around the table, dropping to one knee beside her chair with fluid grace. The ring box in his hand was small and elegant, clearly vintage, the kind of piece that carried family history and generational blessings. "This ring belonged to my grandmother, who survived war and immigration and decades of hardship with my grandfather," Dante said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his pale eyes. "She told me once that the secret to lasting love was finding someone worth protecting with your life, someone whose happiness mattered more than your own survival." He opened the box to reveal a stunning emerald surrounded by diamonds, the stones catching the light and throwing rainbows across the white tablecloth. The ring was beautiful, But it was the love and commitment in Dante's expression that made tears spill down Isla's cheeks. I know my world is complicated, that marrying me means accepting things most people never have to consider, he continued. But I swear to you that you'll never have to be afraid again, never have to face any threat alone, never have to question whether you're loved completely and unconditionally. Isla looked down at this man who had saved her life in every way that mattered, who had shown her what it felt like to be cherished rather than controlled, protected rather than possessed. The decision was easier than breathing. Yes, she whispered, then louder, her voice strong with absolute conviction. Yes, Dante. Yes to all of it. The ring slipped onto her finger like it had been waiting for her all along, the emerald catching the afternoon light as Dante rose to kiss her with a passion that tasted like promises and forever. The months that followed blurred together in a haze of wedding planning and integration into Dante's extended family, who welcomed her with warmth that eased the old wounds left by her own family's rejection. His mother, Elena Romano, was a small, elegant woman in her late 60s who had clearly passed her protective instincts on to her son. She embraced Isla without reservation, sharing family recipes and stories that helped her understand the roots of Dante's unwavering loyalty. His sister Sophia, a successful attorney who managed the legal aspects of the family's legitimate businesses, became the sister Isla had never had. She helped plan a wedding that balanced Dante's need for security with Isla's desire for simple elegance, understanding without explanation why certain precautions were necessary. The wedding itself was perfect, a small ceremony in the vineyard where Dante had proposed, surrounded by family and a few friends who understood the complexities of their world. Isla wore her grandmother-in-law's dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and carried white roses from the garden Elena had cultivated for 40 years. As she walked down the aisle between the grapevines, Isla caught sight of Marco and the other security team members positioned discreetly around the perimeter, their presence a reminder that even this moment of pure joy required protection. But instead of fear, she felt gratitude for the men who had helped keep her safe long enough to reach this happiness. Dante's eyes never left her face as she approached, his expression soft with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. When the officiant asked if she would take this man to be her husband, her voice was strong and clear as she promised to love and honor him for all the days of her life. 6 months later, Isla stood in the kitchen of their penthouse, one hand resting on the small swell of her stomach as she watched Dante prepare dinner with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. The domestic scene was everything she'd never dared dream of during the dark months when survival had been her only goal. The pregnancy had been a surprise, but a welcome one that filled both of them with quiet joy and protective determination. Already, Dante was making plans for additional security, for a house in the suburbs with a yard where their child could play safely, for a future built on love rather than fear. Mrs. Romano, Dante said, looking up from the stove with a smile that never failed to make her pulse quicken. How are my two favorite people feeling today? The casual use of her new name still thrilled her, still made her feel like she belonged somewhere permanent and unchangeable. Happy, she replied, moving to wrap her arms around his waist from behind. Completely, impossibly happy. Sometimes she thought about the scared woman who had dropped that wine glass in Bellinate, frozen with terror at the sight of her stalker. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a previous life who had existed before love and protection and the absolute security of knowing someone would fight the world to keep her safe. Do you ever think about the people watching our story right now? Isla asked, settling at the kitchen island as Dante plated their dinner with restaurant-quality precision. About whether they believe that this kind of love actually exists in real life. Dante considered the question as he poured wine for himself and sparkling water for her, his expression thoughtful. I think people recognize truth when they see it, he said finally. I think anyone who's ever been afraid understands why protection feels like love, and anyone who's ever felt powerless knows why strength can be so attractive. He moved around the island to stand beside her, his hand covering hers where it rested on her stomach. But mostly, I think people want to believe that broken things can be healed, that there's someone out there who will see their worth even when they can't see it themselves. Isla leaned into his warmth, marveling at how completely her life had transformed. She'd entered his world as a victim seeking shelter, but she'd stayed as a woman claiming her right to be loved and protected. The difference mattered, would always matter, in ways that went beyond simple survival. Outside the penthouse windows, the city glittered with the promise of 1,000 stories, 1,000 chances for love to triumph over fear. But inside their sanctuary, surrounded by the security Dante's love provided, Isla knew she'd already found her happily ever after. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility and secured by promises that would never be broken. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Isla wasn't afraid of tomorrow.